So as you mentioned, my doctoral dissertation work was originally meant to be a compare and contrast of different types of foreign fighter groups and the recruitment. And so I'm particularly interested in today's presentations, which I thought were excellent. I'll address a couple of points from each of them. But first, I wanted to provide a broader overview. And one thing in trying to do a compare and contrast and tie these different groups together is it seems like there is actually a lot more to compare than to contrast when we look at groups, not just the ideologies that were presented today, but different groups throughout historical periods. So I can talk a little bit about conflicts like the Spanish Civil War, which certainly is perhaps the most famous case until ISIS of larger numbers than ISIS, of foreign fighters being drawn in. And there were certainly reactions to how do we understand this phenomena then as well, like the propaganda poster on the book cover. But there are other ones that receive a lot less attention. Because before the event today, some of us were talking a little bit about debates and the US presidential debate last night. Joe Biden, obviously in the news a lot with what he went through last night. So one case that perhaps doesn't get as much attention as others is the fact that there were several hundred Diaspora, Albanian mostly, volunteers with the Kosovo Liberation Army in the late 1990s. The largest group was recruited from Germany, but there were a couple of hundred Americans as well who joined a group perhaps modeled after the Spanish Civil War called the Atlantic Brigade. And at the time, certainly this was not illegal. As far as the Americans was concerned, this was in line with US foreign policy. And they received some political support from sitting members of Congress, Joe Biden, one of them in particular. So one thing that I think is very important that a couple of the panelists today mentioned is that the political structures that are available to foreign fighters make a big difference in how they are recruited, how mobilization is facilitated, and what happens to them after they return. One thing that's important, and Casper mentioned this, is foreign terrorist fighters, this term that we used under international law, was created in response to recruitment by ISIS. And under international law, it applies only to ISIS and Al-Qaeda members. If you're not an affiliate of one of these groups, there might be national laws that prevent individuals from going to join different groups, but otherwise, there aren't. So sometimes groups are able to recruit quite openly, and even in there are cases where there are, let's say, international embargoes on conflict areas, like in the Spanish Civil War, groups might operate very openly in their recruitment if the state is not going to ban them, is not going to prosecute people. So you'll see large-scale recruitment efforts by different transnational organizations, like the Communist International or Comintern was certainly one for the Spanish Civil War. You'll also see them for ethnic diaspora groups, like the Albanian groups that recruited for the Kosovo Liberation Army, or Jewish diaspora groups that recruited in the Israeli War of Independence. You see this as well with some Kurdish diaspora groups recruiting members who joined YPG. Again, depending on the circumstances, on how secretive they have to be, you might see an emphasis on knowing somebody. Then that was something that came up in the presentation today, that individuals might be turned away if they don't have the right connections because they're a security risk, or because they're seen as perhaps just being adventurers and not ideologically committed. One thing that's interesting in some of the historical cases is that as the circumstances became worse, like let's say for the international brigades in the Spanish Civil War, they became a lot less choosy about who they would take, whether they were ideologically committed or not. But if the circumstances permit, you'll see public rallies like you saw with the Albanian diaspora, like you saw with some of the Kurdish volunteers, like Joanna Polani, who joined the YPJ, who signed up at a public rally. You'll see this with South African Jews in the Israeli War of Independence. They'll simply pass around sign-up sheets. There's a focus today on new, sort of electronic banking efforts for people to go. There might be some illicit activities. There's some groups that are certainly not welcome in some countries to operate, but there's been different studies showing that most fundraising travel for foreign fighters involves licit means. Timothy Holman, who I think is in the audience today, had a report looking at Belgian fighters saying that the ones who were engaged in domestic terrorism kept separate from the ones who were trying to travel to Iraq in the 2000s because they didn't want any domestic crimes to tip people off about their travel plans. There was a report by the Program on Extremism just that came out yesterday, looking at volunteers joining ISIS, Americans who almost exclusively were raising money through legal means or using their own finances. The internet has had an effect. I think in addition to sort of crowdfunding efforts, there has been the effect, as some of the participants mentioned, of having foreign fighters be poster boys now, be reporting from the scene and lending legitimacy to the efforts, saying, hey, be like me, look how it is here, or groups even celebrating them and saying, look, we have Westerners joining us, this makes us more legitimate, this makes the cause broader. Historically, that wasn't the case. Historically, foreign fighters would be played down in most cases by the groups that joined them because they thought it would make them look weaker or more illegitimate. So that has been a shift with social media. It also meant in the past foreign fighters were more often used as cannon fodder by the groups they joined. And now they can't afford to do that in a lot of cases because that will result in immediate bad publicity. It was easier to do that when the message was mediated by the groups as they came out. But even with the rise of the internet, formal institutions still matter. You've always had handfuls of individuals traveling to join groups, but groups typically discourage that. They want to be able to control who joins them. You can find chat boards with the Islamic State of Iraq, the precursor to ISIS in the 2000s, saying, don't just make passionate jihad, don't just show up on your own without training. Get some training yourself first and let us direct you when you arrive here. Otherwise, you'll be wasted. One case, I have to say, read my book on this one because I don't have time to go into the Texas Revolution, but this is almost 200 years ago in Mexico. There was a big effort to bring in foreign volunteers. There were actually far more European nationals fighting at the Alamo than there were people from Texas, as a matter of fact, with the volunteers. And they saw themselves as Anglo-Saxon. And in a lot of these cases, including Texas, it's not really possible for the rebel groups, as the participants mentioned today, to pay volunteers a lot. They'll use this framing of you're part of a community that is under threat. It's your obligation to do something. It will be, you have to defend your people. They target young men and use very gendered appeals to saving civilians. And this was the case in the Texas Revolution as well. It was presented as defending white Anglo-Saxon Protestants against Hispanic Catholic oppression. And it was illegal in the United States at the time, even then, to recruit to join foreign insurgent groups. So they would offer free land. The idea that somebody would want to, become a farmer in a war zone seems kind of laughable, but they would use these notions of go over there, we'll organize you. Down at the bottom in the fine print, they say, we have plenty of arms, just don't worry about your safety. So in this case, it was illegal. They couldn't openly say what they wanted people to do. But this is, again, dependent upon the enforcement at the time. The brick and mortar locations matter, very much as well, though. Besides the propaganda, you'll have, obviously, there was a lot of attention in the pre-internet days paid to so-called radical mosques. And there were certain houses of worship in the case of the jihadis, but also union halls in the case of some of the, the far left volunteers, I guess you would call them, who joined the Spanish Civil War, or diaspora summer camps and some of the ethnic cases that I've mentioned. So these brick and mortar institutions, even in the ISIS era, still matter. You'll find clusters of people joining, and that's something I'll talk about a little bit more in the individual comments. City locations as well. You find examples before social media that groups use whatever media, popular media of the day is available, whether it's Hollywood films, and this is a case, again, brick and mortar in-person matters. They also function as sign-up locations. This was a Broadway play that was produced expressly to raise money for an independent Jewish state in the 1940s. And so, if you couldn't involve people at that time online and request donations online, you would get them to see a play, which is not illegal, had an all-star cast, including Marlon Brando in it. So again, different circumstances allow for different types of recruitment and different types of messaging. People would sign up actually as volunteers for some of the merchant ships at some of these events as well. If you couldn't say openly that people should go join a conflict, these are from the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, you could, encourage people to donate money in surreptitious ways, or, if you couldn't go from, you could sell pamphlets celebrating the cause. Again, they don't really offer people money, but if it was really about money or just excitement opportunities, they probably wouldn't use the framing of there's a threat to the community, you have to be heroic. They do this because they're trying to involve more people than I think want to sign up as mercenaries for underfunded rebel groups. In some cases, when you have organized diaspora groups or transnational groups like the Communist International, they will actually create their own front companies, including front travel companies, to facilitate arrangement. They will provide false letters of employment, where people can apply for passports saying I have a job offer in a country next to the conflict zone. So that's something that we see as well. They'll certainly provide packing lists, although those tend to be circulated more on the internet these days. Individuals will tend to disconnect from relatives. The groups encourage that. Perhaps if they're able to, they'll have training or indoctrination facilities in the home countries of origin, or sometimes they'll have it where they are traveling to before they go into the war zone. One thing I found in interviews I conducted with volunteers in the Israeli War of Independence is people said, I had friends whose family members prevented them from going. So there's or encouraged them to come back. So we see this with jihadis as well. There's a real discouragement from being involved with family members. Mothers in particular are seen as good at preventing people from becoming too involved in these outside groups. We see, and this was mentioned today, there's a reliance on organized crime. Who else is going to know how to get you, in some cases through mountainous terrain, into a conflict area to bring the armaments in as well. We'll see cases where individuals will arrive in certain locations, and as long as the security concerns aren't paramount, there'll be competition between different groups or different units within organizations. Say, oh, here's somebody who presumably has skills, who certainly has fundraising connections externally. You'll see competition between different groups for members. That's something that's consistent historically as well, once they arrive in border regions. And a couple more points. We talked about returnees and their role. Clint Watts, a decade ago, made the point that there's a lot of, in countries with lower internet penetration rates in the 2000s, you would see people who had returned as jihadis having a real sense of credibility. They became the facilitators because they knew the right people to talk to. And they could also, say, look, you can be a hero like me in the community. A report that I worked on with a couple of colleagues this year showed that a lot of jihadis who go on to join multiple groups become leaders of these different groups. They become attack coordinators. They engage in plots. They also become recruiters. They write the manuals for how to be a foreign fighter for these groups. So there's a threat from returnees, from career foreign fighters who don't return as well. They have the effect of leadership. Casper also talked about in his report earlier this year about how there are some fighters in Ukraine who'd been involved in conflicts elsewhere and had used their connections to bring people in from other conflict zones, Syria, Bosnia, and elsewhere. And finally, again, just to the point, perhaps a new direction in looking at what happens with foreign fighters and with logistics. Some of us, maybe are familiar with the Malhama Tactical. It's this, I suppose, Chechen-based jihadi group saying we fought in Syria and now you can pay us in Bitcoin to make jihad elsewhere. But they're illicit groups who are not FTFs, not foreign terrorist fighters. So you've seen a Canadian group that was anti-ISIS fighters that's set up as an NGO. There's an American group that's been operative in Myanmar, but has also now operating in Iraq, getting government contracts for security and development work. So whether you see this cynically or you see this as an opportunity to perhaps find constructive ways to use returned foreign fighters who aren't engaged in war crimes, there's sort of this legal sphere, this private security sector sphere emerging for foreign fighters as well.